Make Real specialises in creating immersive learning solutions across a range of technologies. To download their latest academic paper on how to turn learners into activists, visit makereal.co.uk/activists. Where do babies come from? What is a mortgage? And why does your face go all funny when you talk about it, Mama? Why does Grandpa smell of wee? These are the sort of challenging questions our children ask us. But before you give them some fob-off answer or tell them to shut up and watch Peppa Pig, hold your horses. That question could be a learning opportunity. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
It's high time we gave some consideration on this podcast to the short people who live in your house, trash your furniture, embarrass you in front of strangers, and do their best to stop you doing all the fun things you used to do back in the days when you were young, free, and had a life. Oh, but think of the joy. Think of the joy. My guest this time has written a book about how we should talk to these people and make each conversational exchange a teachable moment. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact. Who is she?
Hack Facts.
Dr. Rebecca Rolland is a speech pathologist and education lecturer. For over a decade, her consultancy has helped her clients to improve their communication in order to build thriving classrooms, relationships, and families. Rebecca is a member of Harvard's Graduate School of Education and the Boston Children's Hospital, where she uses psychoeducational assessment tools and her own experience as a mother to diagnose children's learning difficulties and offer solutions. Her recent book, The Art of Talking with Children, was published in March of this year.
So, Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact, standing in for Jay Curtis, Head of Themes, who is on the Camino de Santiago. What themes did we cover?
Rebecca's book was the jumping off point for your conversation. You talked about how you hold rich conversations with children, but you also covered how this can transfer to conversations with adults and how the techniques can be useful at work. And touching on her experience as a speech pathologist, you also discussed how well needs groups and people with dyslexia are catered for.
Before we even thought of covering this subject on the podcast, I think I already appreciated that conversations can be powerful for learning. But after talking with Rebecca and reading her book, what came home to me was that learning is a conversation. Dr. Rolland, welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
There's a lot of talk about pronouns in education at the moment, but it's good to see that some educationalists also have a firm grasp of prepositions. I was impressed that your recently published book is called The Art of Talking with Children, not The Art of Talking to Children. We tend to think learning is a matter of transmission, and it's not. It also involves interaction, conversation. In fact, one could say, in a sense, learning is a conversation. In the book, you refer to conversation being better when they are rich. What makes a conversation with a child rich?
Yeah, so that's, I definitely agree with that. I think learning is a conversation. And when we can have conversations with children that are rich, we learn more about them. And I think they also learn more about the subject. So I've talked about a framework that has 3 components, A, B, C. A is for adaptive, meaning that we are actually going with the flow of what the child's moods are, his or her temperament, and so on. We're actually paying attention to what makes the child tick. B is for back and forth. So actually not talking to the child, as you mentioned, but really emphasizing having an equal speaking role for the child and having them be able to extend their speaking. And C for child-driven. So this is really considering not just focusing on what we want to focus on, but really what is motivating the child, what is interesting to them, what's on their mind, what's worrying them. And this framework of ABC is what makes conversations richer.
All right. And you talk about the concept of conversational rituals, rituals perhaps that we carry on from childhood. If you had to pick one of these rituals to change, what would it be? And put another way, which ritual do you think benefits us the least in the way that we talk with children?
Yes, I think probably for me and what I've seen among my colleagues and friends is the after work or after school ritual when we are asking, how was your day? How are things? What happened today? Who did you sit with? Kind of these series of questions that are sort of probing questions that we immediately ask as soon as we come together. And although these questions are maybe things we want to know, oftentimes children are overstimulated at that moment. They've had very long days and they're not really able to engage in that conversation. So oftentimes we end up frustrated as the adults in their lives and they end up frustrated as the children. So actually taking a moment even to be silent and then rethinking those conversations, I think would be really helpful.
Could you give an example of how a rich conversation might happen? You know, how the dialogue could be opened up, as you say, and extended?
Yes, definitely. So I would say one conversation I've often had with my children is about mistakes. And so one thing we talk about often is just what mistake did we make in our daily lives? Why do we think it happened? And how might we change it or prevent it from happening in the future? And we do this in a way that's very lighthearted and relaxed, rather than saying, oh, we're going to harp on or ruminate about mistakes. But for example, even to say, oh, I didn't bring my umbrella to work, and so I got drenched. This is what happened. But I sort of direct compassion toward myself. I realized I was in a rush, and I think about how I could improve this in the future. And in that case, we're actually opening ourselves up to children as saying that we aren't perfect, saying that every life is full of these small areas where we can always improve. And then also opening ourselves up to brainstorming from others and to feedback from others about how we might change, the mistakes that we make in our daily lives.
And I think you gave an example of a child who said, saying, "Oh no, I never make mistakes."
Yes.
And what's the strategy you use to get beyond that? Stop
yes,
it.
yes. And I do think sort of our gut reaction, I would say, is to argue with a child. Oh, of course you do. Do you remember that time when et cetera happened?
That's
but
what
I think,
do, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I actually do think that tends to be counterproductive, because what you're doing is you're setting up this back and forth, which is bound to be a conflict. Then the child will say, that wasn't really a mistake, I meant to do that. Or, that was his fault, that wasn't my fault. So what I would actually do is just let it go and continue to model throughout the day, or even just in minor moments, oh, I made this mistake, I should have done that. But, that's not a big deal. I can do this and this, further. And even make it into kind of a game to see if I can catch my mistakes. One thing I've actually done with my son recently is we played chess, and he actually now asks me, can we play mistakes, which is that each of us on purpose makes mistakes and sees if the other person can find the mistake and actually use it to their benefit, which has been really fun, and also does suggest these mistakes are things we can make even as learning moments.
Yeah, I think a lot of chess players would say chess is about spotting the other people, even at a high level. It's about spotting where a mistake's been made. Mistake isn't always apparent. You give a lot of strategies for opening up conversations with children, which I think are very useful to people. Is there a difficulty for parents though? I'm thinking, I don't know if this is more a thing with Brits perhaps than it is in the US, but there feels a kind of falseness about saying these things. For instance, I had a son who worked in a Montessori school, and he would come home and tell us all the ways that he had to speak to the children, which were good ways. Like, when they came in the morning, say, now, if you need to go and make your body comfortable, then the room to do that is through there. And we kind of laugh about this and say, why don't you just say, go to the loo?
Yes.
So but the serious point is that there feels like this kind of artificiality that maybe holds some parents back from doing this, and the sassy kids would say, why are you talking to me like an HR manager?
Right. Yes. And one thing I do appreciate, and I put a lot in the book, is this idea of being adaptive. So that means really honoring your own style, honoring your sense of humor, your sarcasm, and so if something feels to you really false, or as though it's not in line with the, your relationship with your child or the children in your life, I would suggest not doing it. I don't think there's any perfect recipe that, if we all fell into this, or if we all said it this way, it would be great. I think what is important is just to think about what values you're trying to transmit. So, for example, making your body comfortable. Obviously, maybe that feels weird or that sounds weird to you, but how else, in your mind, could you come across with this idea of like, well, we all want to be comfortable here. So, if you need to go to the bathroom, that makes you comfortable, go to the bathroom, but to still emphasize that same point, that same idea, maybe without the same words.
It's kind of about the structure of conversations rather than
Exactly.
the actual words that you might use. Does it throw a bit of a burden on parents to learn a lot of new skills, do you think, to have these rich conversations?
I think initially there are some things to learn. I also think that so many of us feel maybe frustrated or just, as if our daily conversations feel tedious or there are these ruts. So I actually think that I talk about a double promise in the book, which is that you are building these longer term skills over time, but also in the moment, these conversations should be sort of more interesting, more pleasurable, more enjoyable for your family than your prior conversations. So even though there is some degree of, time and attention that you'd want to pay initially, I think kind of the benefits outweigh, a little bit of extra effort there.
Yeah, and of course, some parents just seem to be able to do this naturally, I think.
Yeah, I do think there's a range of some parents are, I'd say, better listeners, some are better communicators, sort of noticing your strengths, I think, is important.
So this is a learning podcast. So can you talk a bit specifically about the part that these type of rich conversations play in learning?
Definitely, yes. And I think for all ages, these conversations are so critical for learning because what it's doing is it's shifting the adult's framework from being kind of the oracle or the person who knows, the expert, to being a guide in curiosity and to coming along a learning journey with a child. So that really means several things. And one is which really we want to think about having the adult verbalize what you know, what you don't know, what your questions are, and so on. So oftentimes children think, oh, this is the parent, this is the teacher, they're the knowledgeable one here to transmit, whatever they have to say. But by opening up this conversation and saying, oh, here as the adult, these are things I don't know, these are things I'm wondering about, you really are providing an opportunity for the child to say, oh, well, this person wants to go on this journey with me and can actually broaden and deepen my thinking.
Is there a bit of vulnerability in that? And that they, oh, how can I learn from you? You don't seem to know anything.
Yes, I mean, I do think there is some humility for sure to say, of course I don't know everything. But at the same time, I've made the argument that, some of the greatest scientists, the philosophers on the planet, they have the most interesting questions. They're not the ones who are the most wise or the people who have the most knowledge, but really the ones who know how to ask the questions. So I think putting it that way and kind of shifting it into sort of a question asking mode and interrogation, I think can help a lot of kids too.
Interrogation sounds a bit bad, but
interrogation in a curious way, not in a prison way.
yeah. Too much conversation is interrogation.
Yes, exactly.
I can't remember which song that comes from. What you say in the book has a theoretical basis in science. You have a background as a clinician. I know that's important for our listeners, that there is theoretical basis. They tend to be very interested in evidence-informed learning. That's a very big thing among our listener base. Could you talk a bit about the major learning theories that underpin the advice that you're giving in the book? Because it's very readable, it's very approachable, and that's good. But you don't necessarily go into, oh, this piece of theory comes from this person, although, there's bibliography and there are, copious notes. But could you talk a bit about the major learning theories that are underpinning what you're saying? And you're allowed to name names. It won't frighten us away.
Oh, good. Yes, no, definitely. I really did do a lot of research, both in terms of the theoretical pieces and in actually, how this could work. So a lot of my book was linking what we know from the research about conversation into, what are strategies that are takeaways. So just as some examples, I do a lot of research based on Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So this idea that children are at a certain level, and by scaffolding them, you can move them and stretch and extend their thinking to a deeper level, to a further level. But at the same time, obviously, you can't just jump completely abstractly or jump completely away from the child zone because you're not actually able to support or scaffold them in that way. So actually finding kind of the right scaffolding and the right level of conversation is really important, and that's kind of where that comes from. I also looked a lot at Piaget, just stage theory, and then self-determination theory. So this is really the theory that people can become self-determined, but they have needs for autonomy, competence, and connection. So helping children feel as though, okay, they're in control to some extent of their own behaviors. They actually are able to affect change in their own lives. They can gain mastery of, tasks. They can feel competent. And they also can feel, in doing so, related to other people. So for me, that sort of connection and belonging and through mastery has been really important in laying out, I had these 7 pillars in my book. So I really sort of relied heavily on those.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, Piaget is a name that comes up a lot when one talks to people on the education side of the field. I think less well regarded on the workplace learning side. The evidence base behind his work isn't felt to be that good. And I know the person I co-present the Great Minds on Learning podcast with, Donald Clark, has some severe reservations about Vygotsky. But it's very interesting to know where you're coming from in the stuff that you put across. And it's all very helpful knowledge. What applicability do you feel your work has to the field of adult learning? The sort of conversations, for instance, a manager might have with employees, for example, or that a head of learning and development in an organisation might have with someone who has some identified performance issues for anything. Is there a straight read across? I mean, I know that there some people talk about andragogy. Malcolm Knowles has his fans, but a lot of people, it's very usual, I find nowadays, for people to say there's no difference. The theory works across the board. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I do think it has applicability. I don't think it completely transfers perfectly. I've actually done a lot of work and worked with Robert Keegan and some of his adult learning theories as well, which he does a lot of work on workplace learning and just stages of development in adult thinking and learning as well. And for me, I think a lot of the parts of being adaptive especially is very critical, understanding the stage or sort of the ways of thinking. I don't actually feel as if those stages are as fixed as they may come across. And I think that's part of what I have struggled with Piaget as well, is thinking that, I don't think it is as, as fixed or as jumping as Piaget, would suggest. But I do think there's a lot of room in adult learning for actually understanding in the workplace, well, what is the framework of this person's thinking? What are their motivations? Where are the gaps between, say, their values and their actions? And having to have those conversations, not in a sort of punitive way or in a way only after things have gone wrong, but actually having them proactively to understand kind of where that person can stretch, where they can provide their senses of competence and mastery, I do think is really critical.
So obviously there is a change of register when you're talking to an adult, and it'd be pretty criminal to talk to an adult in the same way that you talk to the child. But is it structurally, is the stuff the same? It's just a matter of the different type of language you might use, or?
Yes, definitely. And that's actually what I've emphasized even in my book, going throughout the ages of children. So some people have said, well, it's obviously not the same to talk to a toddler as it is to talk to a high school senior or a college student. And that's obviously true as well. So we all know that you would not use the same language or, the same sentence structure. But the same frameworks really do hold. And I think that throughout development, I really do see it as a continuum, from childhood all the way through adulthood of, people are still driven by the need to connect, still driven by curiosity and wanting to find things out. And these things may be hidden by other concerns. Obviously, adults want to earn money and they want to, do lots of other things. But I think that these values are still really fundamental. And by respecting them and respecting kind of the personhood of each person, whether or not it's, a younger person or an older person, I think is really important, and I think does hold for all the ages.
Yeah, that on that theme, there is a massive difference in having a conversation with a 10-year-old to having a conversation with a 14-year-old. You know, something has happened in those intervening years
Yes.
that just completely seems to turn everything round, you know, puberty and adolescence.
Yes.
We're talking about. And some educational theories, there seems to be a bit of a blind spot, but other theorists have zeroed in on this, that there is a real transfer of loyalties from the parents to the peer group that happens there. Would that, apart from the way that you would talk to a teenager as opposed to a pre-teen, is there any structural difference, do you think? You know, do things alter there?
Yes, I mean, I do think obviously there's the physical side, and also just mentally the ability to be more, have more sort of meta awareness of one's own thinking, of one's, even of one's sort of foibles and flaws. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of impulsivity we know, especially in the teenage years, which is very typical that becomes very high, that, you know, teenagers do struggle with impulse control and so on. But because they are actually more able to think abstractly, you actually do have more opportunity, at least after the fact and proactively, to reflect on, you know, what's happening, what this means for the child or the teenager, him or herself, what they might do differently and so on. So I think there's a lot more opportunity for that back and forth to be, you know, more reflective of actually thinking about our learning, thinking about our mistakes in sort of a more abstract way.
In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. So thinking about that transition from education into the workplace, we kind of move forward in the ages a bit. A lot of your work is related to those with special educational needs. You know, a lot of it's been kind of therapeutic. I'm thinking, for example, of a recent example on autism for psychologytoday.com that you wrote. As these learners age and move into the job market, do you think that there's adequate provision and training to support those needs? Are there any needs group who you feel are particularly failing to receive support?
Yes, definitely. I do think that there is a lot of room for support that's needed, especially as teenagers and young adults are aging into the workplace and aging into kind of owning their own houses, apartments, and so on. And especially, I would say, those teenagers and young adults who have autism, I think there's been a lot of support, especially for the younger years and even, you know, going up through the teenage years. But oftentimes, you know, there just isn't a lot afterwards in order to provide kind of enough support that they feel they're able to take on new challenges, but not so much support that they're not, you know, able to find independence. So that's one group. Another group I would say are students and children who have attentional issues, like ADHD. A lot of times we know that, you know, they might have been supported, they might have been given lots of structure even through high school. But when they get to college or university, a lot of times they're not even declaring or noting the fact that they have these issues to their universities, which just makes it very hard to know how to support them. There's also not a lot of structural support. So I think it is a big challenge because we have so many highly capable young people, but who do need higher levels of support than we may be giving at that level. So it's sort of a chance for a lot of them to fall through the cracks, unfortunately.
Yeah, and as they move from university into the job market, is there, you know, there are a lot of balls dropped there, do you think?
Definitely, yes. I think even just to recognize the strengths and sort of the opportunities for some of these individuals to provide value and to feel competent and to give skills in a workplace setting. So a lot of times with the right supports in place, a lot of these young people can provide great value. Whether it's, I've worked with kids, for example, with autism who are really great at designing video games. So they've been able to do that work, but they also have sort of their employers who have in mind what their needs are, what their communication strengths and challenges are, and are able to work with that. So without that, a lot of times, they can potentially say the wrong thing, they could get fired, that kind of thing, and really not be able to give their skills to society. So I do think those kind of conversations between a workplace and somebody applying for a job and recognizing the stigma and trying to reduce some of the stigma is really important.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I've worked a lot in e-learning companies, and you get a lot of kind of underdiagnosed and diagnosed autism, Asperger's, in, for instance, coders. I don't want to stereotype anybody, but this is what people have worked with and observed. Also, very high levels of dyslexia in graphic designers, for instance, which is a bit difficult for those who have to proof the work and so on. We're more aware of that stuff nowadays than we used to be. Perhaps not as aware as we ought to be, but when we kind of look back, one of the things I found interesting on our other sister podcast, Great Minds on Learning, is we look at kind of theories like learning styles. You see people trying to come to grips with the differences between learners and the different abilities of learners, and putting them into these frameworks like learning styles, which is pretty well discredited now.
Yes.
And at the time, there was a lot of kind of undiagnosed dyslexia, autism, and so on. And I think you can see that people are actually trying to find a way of dealing with difference within learners, but the diagnoses weren't there. It also makes me wonder kind of what is there that we're not diagnosing now? Because, we made all those, it's not like we're perfect now,
Yes.
Is there a load of stuff? Do you see anything that is just not being picked up?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I'd have to think about it. I do think that I do see a lot of challenges, I would say with empathy, that I wouldn't say that, there's a, diagnosable challenge with empathy, but I do think maybe because of, how much kids have been more isolated, or how much they've been more on media, or for any number of reasons, or the sort of competition or, achievement above all else kind of push. I do see a lot of young people who struggle to understand kind of why should they care about others, or why should they care about more global issues, even to the point of where their abstract thinking is fine and they're able to conceive of these things. But I would be curious if there's if that's something that's going to come up, because as we face so many global challenges, I think that's something that's going to be critical for our young people. And obviously some of them are extreme, empaths and sort of empathetic, but I think there's a large segment that struggle with that.
It's interesting that you mentioned the kind of technology, social media side of things. What sort of dialogues do you think younger learners are inheriting from their online sources? And there's always a tech panic at any given era, but do you see anything kind of specific in the use of constant attachment to the phones and social media that is coming up, that is changing the sort of dialogues that
Yes,
have?
Definitely. Yeah. So I think a couple things. First, I definitely recognize kind of the overall panic about technology in general. And just to say, I'm not on the side of saying, we must take away all the phones and social media is the cause of all ills. I think that's very easy to say, and it probably is much more
very frequently said.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And I do think it's much more complex than that. And I wouldn't want to point fingers at one particular issue. I think there are certain uses of technology and social media that are particularly damaging. And I think there's some new research on that. For example, especially young girls who are looking at Instagram, looking at sort of images of perfection and comparing themselves to these images. I do think this sort of social comparison and leaves one, with a, deflated sense of self, and oftentimes a sense that, I'll never be good enough, or how can I live up to this other, this ideal selves. I think that's really challenging. And similarly, just attentional issues with the kind of TikTok scrolling of, constant, there's been some research showing, how fast these images are just appearing and how constant they are. And so I think to do that as kind of a routine habit, to always be scrolling and scrolling very quickly, I do think probably has cognitive and probably emotional impacts. But I wouldn't say kind of all social media uses are equal. I think oftentimes they can connect kids, there can be creative uses of it. So I wouldn't say it's all bad, but I think certain ways of using it can be detrimental for sure.
While we're on the subject of technology, have you come across much technology-enabled learning? And what's your how do you feel about the current state of that and how helpful it is or otherwise in promoting, stopping conversations, changing, giving us new types of conversations?
Yes, I think some of it is fascinating. I think I've had good and bad experiences with it. And I do think the more that it promotes actual dialogue between people as kind of an end result, the more helpful it can be. And the more it kind of, just assumes that it, as the system or the computer, knows all about the learner and remains kind of a closed loop, I think it becomes less effective in that way. So, for example, programs that are working to kind of assess in fun ways children's learning, and then the teacher is able to get those results and say, oh, now I know more about kind of the specific needs of this child in terms of what he or she knows and doesn't know about the curriculum. I think that can be very useful. But I do think we're not at a point where we can replace teaching with technology. And I think the attempts to do that, for me, have been mostly disappointing.
They have been going, there's a long lineage of that from kind of like Sidney Pressey and the teaching machines of B.F. Skinner. And, and I suppose the most recent instantiation of that kind of concept is adaptive learning, where you have a kind of system which can teach people. And it's interesting that you used the word adaptive about conversations earlier. There's always a slight difference in the way that technology does something. So although the word adaptive is the same in adaptive learning and the type of adaptive conversations you're talking about, it's a slightly different thing. Have you come up against those type of technologies at all? Do you have a view?
Yes, and I do. I think obviously it's interesting that you bring that up, because for me, adaptive in the human conversation side has to do with kind of this embodied conversation. So really using all of the senses, adapting in multiple ways, so you're adapting whether it's your tone, whether it's the time, we're very complex as human beings, obviously, and children are very complex. So it's not adapting kind of in one way, the way that adaptive learning often does, whether it's, to get harder, to get easier, to change, that sort of thing. So computers are obviously still limited in the ways they're adapting and are not sensorial beings. But I do think that there is some room for that in terms of supporting students, for example, not to be learning material they've already mastered. So if a student's showing, okay, I'm getting this, I'm getting that, having some level of adapting to that can be helpful. At the same time, I think I put a big emphasis on understanding the child's thinking. And that, I think, from what I've seen of the adaptive learning technologies, it doesn't do a lot of that to actually understand, well, what's the process of the child coming to this answer? Where are the holes in thinking? I think that's possible to be done, to sort of look at learning and thinking processes, but I don't see a lot out there that's more qualitative doing that in terms of adaptive learning.
So you're not worried about your job being automated in the short term?
Not in the short term, at least.
To put a more serious spin on that last question, people kind of speculate about, some people, journalists particularly, will talk about how very, very soon our robot overlords will come in and replace us all, and this function will go and that function will go on. And, and teaching is one of these that kind of gets brought up. But I think a lot of different people in different areas have different feelings, gut feelings about how long it would take for that to happen. What's yours? I mean, you're obviously a lot younger than me, so for me it's academic. I won't be around, which gives a clue about how long I think it will take. Do you have a sense of the forward timeline for AI getting so smart that it can replace a lot of what you do?
I would say that's a good question. I would say there are pieces of it that could be done sooner. For example, assessing a child's reading. I think that could be done relatively sooner, because you can look at things like the time. You could have voice input and have the computer look at errors and analyze that. There are some, obviously, that are already moving in that direction. Things like writing output is more challenging because there's more qualitative data. You can look at very basic things like how much output there is, how many errors there are, but getting to the sort of the quality of the writing is definitely more difficult, more of a value judgment. But I would definitely not say for several decades. And actually, for me, teaching is a fundamentally human endeavor between people. So I'm not sure that I ever think technology will entirely replace teaching, I would say. I would say aspects of it, but I'm not sure it will ever be fundamentally AI driven.
I think it's going to take a while. Computers can beat Garry Kasparov at chess happened ages ago and play chess without making any mistakes, but because that's a kind of single, very focused thing. What they're very bad at is context.
Exactly.
And precisely some of the things you describe, your book is very much about raising parents' kind of awareness and consciousness of how having conversations with children can open things up rather than closing down in very interesting ways. And I'd recommend it to parents. Given the kind of constituency of this podcast, though, I'd like you to sort of see drawing from that, what advice would you give to businesses and managers about how to best to manage employee needs based on these kind of principles? If we take my initial kind of proposition that learning is a conversation.
Definitely, yeah. So I think to really, as soon as someone comes into the organization, who comes into the company, I think to really open up that conversation, about what it is their goals are for, their work, what it is their values are, and as much as obviously people do not necessarily share everything initially. So I think to actually have open channels of communication and to be able to check in with employees, if something goes well, and even if something goes wrong, to actually see and understand how they're thinking about it, how it's affecting them emotionally, what would they do differently? What could they do differently? Rather than sort of making blanket decisions, in terms of, we're going to just fire this person or this person's not productive enough, to actually get in and start to try to work it out or see if it can be worked out with that person as a conversation. And if there's something going on, I think, in the employee's life, we know so much has been stressful, so much has been upended. And to actually recognize that and bring that into conversations, even just having conversations about mental well-being, about kind of work routines and things like that, I think can be so helpful in actually improving productivity, rather than saying, we're just going to, have everyone do X, Y, and Z, or they don't do it.
You said a very interesting thing at the beginning there that sparked something for me. We said finding out about their values, because I've worked a lot of induction programs, mostly technology-enabled learning, and they will begin with, these are the values,
Yes.
these are our values,
Exactly.
These are now your values.
Right.
But you're suggesting actually we should kind of find out what their values are. I think that's intriguing.
Yeah, I do think that, I think that could be very helpful, and also just to actually see and help the employees see if there is a match, hopefully there is some level of match between the company's stated values and the employees' values, or even in what ways the employees' values do overlap. And that could suggest a way forward in terms of how they want to contribute, how they want to provide value, and so on, rather than just assuming, here's our values, you're going to come and adopt them wholeheartedly, which most people can't and don't do. I do think that's much more effective to have it as a conversation.
Of course, if there's a real mismatch of values, that could be quite disastrous.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a good thing to find out early on, actually. Yeah.
Well, it would certainly kind of throw up a few flaws in the recruitment process.
Yes, exactly.
Lastly, what are you up to next after this book? This book came out in January. You're probably still kind of recovering from that, having written a book yourself. I know it's not an easy thing to do. What are you up to next? What are you looking to in the future, and how can people best follow that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that I'm actually thinking about how this work can be adapted for teachers and kind of professional development and things like that. So actually, how do these conversations work in different curricula? How could you adapt and incorporate them and so on? That's kind of one thread of my work. And then another is that I'm actually working on how this kind of book might be quote unquote translated or reframed for children. So actually a book for children about how conversations work, how they can communicate better with parents, with their friends, and so on. Because I do think it would be helpful to equip the younger generation with this as well. This is obviously an adult book, so I think that would be a fun project.
That's interesting. So, any children's books about conversational strategies? I think there's some pretty good ones out there already.
There's some good ones
honest.
for sure, but I'd like to see how this could transfer at least. So.
What's your favorite children's book?
That's a really good question. I would say, I love all the Curious George books. I would say those are.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you give examples of those in the book.
Yeah. I also like Frog and Toad. I love listening to those. They're very classic, but I think there are just so many really sweet and kind of profound stories in there, which I actually think have a lot of meaning for adults as well, if you listen to them.
Yeah. And where can people follow you best online? Are you a Twitter person, a LinkedIn person, an Instagram person?
Yeah, I have both. I have probably LinkedIn, but you can find me also on my website, which is just RebeccaRolland.com with 2 C's in Rebecca and 2 L's in Rolland, so it's probably easiest.
Well, it's certainly been an interesting and rich conversation for me today, if that doesn't sound too cheesy. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and all our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Next time, we'll be talking to David James about an important piece of research on learning in the flow of work. We all love to use that buzz phrase, but is workflow learning actually working? Until then,
stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.